Okay, welcome to the American Probation and Parole Association's webinar, What is the Native Difference? Probation Supervision of Gang-Affiliated Native American Youth. My name is Adam Matz. I am a Research Associate with APPA. The lead presenter for today's training is Dave Rogers, Tribal Public Safety Training Manager for the National Criminal Justice Training Center of Fox Valley Technical College. Dave is the Director of the Tribal Probation Academy and the National Indian Youth Police Academy. He possesses a wealth of experience in the field, including 9 years as a probation officer. Also assisting with the webinar is Mary Ann Moat, a research associate with APPA as well. She has over 26 years of experience in community corrections. The presentation is expected to last 60 minutes, with 30 minutes remaining for questions. We encourage you to post questions in the chat box during the presentation. At the end, we will try to answer as many of the questions as possible. There is also a brief survey at the conclusion of the broadcast. Please complete the survey and feel free to make additional comments. Your feedback will aid us in improving future broadcasts and trainings. Please note the webinar is being recorded and will be made available through the APPA website and APPA's PSN dedicated website. Contact information will be provided at the end if you would like to follow up with the presenters. Also, feel free to send us an email for a copy of the PowerPoint presentation. Finally, we want to thank the Bureau of Justice Assistance of the Department of Justice for their support of this training through the Project Safe Neighborhoods, anti-gun, and gang initiatives. Formed in 2001, PSN is a nationwide initiative aimed at the reduction of gun and gang violence. Heavily influenced by programs such as CompStat, Operation Ceasefire, and Exile, PSN was originally aimed at reducing gun violence. Today, PSN's focus has shifted to a predominantly anti-gang initiative, though guns are tied heavily to gang violence and remain a focus. Administered by the 94 U.S. District Attorney's offices, APPA is one of many partners who are authorized to provide PSN training to local jurisdictions. Today's webinar specifically concerns tribal gang issues. Future webinars will discuss rural gang issues and police probation parole partnerships. One of the primary components of PSN is the promotion of collaborations and partnerships. Today's presentation is designed to further promote collaboration between tribe and non-tribal jurisdictions in dealing with a rising youth gang problem. At this time, I'd like to pass the presentation over to Mr. Dave Rogers. Thank you. Dave, I'm not sure if your phone is muted, but we're having trouble hearing you. Dave, if you're there, if you could hang up your phone and then call back in, because nobody's able to hear you right now, even though you're technically unmuted. And I apologize to the audience for the difficulty.
Okay, I called back in. Can Adam confirm you can hear me or not?
Yes, you're good now. You sound great. Thanks.
You can hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. All right. I'll try to go back to where I was. If you can hear me, what I was saying was that we didn't see Native American gangs in Indian country until the early to mid-90s. At that time, we had started the Indian Country training initiatives for the COPS office, and I had a team of instructors who we were traveling around Indian Country in 1999. One of my instructors at that time was a Northern Cree fellow, and he was teaching community policing, but he was by trade a field street level youth gang outreach worker for the city of Portland, Oregon. As we traveled from tribal community, we saw that there were signs of gang activity, and we would bring that to the attention of tribal police and tribal councils and other officials, and there was a lot of denial and a lot of comments that it would never get serious beyond the point of just the wannabe activity. So one of the things that we started to do was record what we were seeing in Indian country. There was some early recognition of this problem, and prior to this time there may have been small groups of youth who would get together and do stuff, but as far as the defined street level type of gang, that just began appearing in the 90s. The first gangs we saw that were actually structured in that way were on the Navajo Reservation, and then we slowly saw them develop over the decade to where they are today. There is an estimation now that there are over 400 gangs on reservations today. That can really vary because there's some question as to the definition of what gangs on reservations are or are not. But at Navajo, they have one gang officer per district, and there is significant gang activity there. But if you speak to the Navajo police, they will tell you that they feel that they have their issues under control, though it did go a fairly high level there for a while with some meth operations that were taking place there. Where the influence of gangs came from in Indian country is not too different from where it comes from when it comes to rural and small communities. Obviously, the movies, music, television has had a big impact with the tribes. In talking to a lot of folks, there was a movie that came out in the 80s that had a very big impact on a lot of rural and small communities, and that was the movie Colors, and that starred Robert Duvall and Sean Penn. That movie depicted the gang culture life on the streets of Los Angeles, and a lot of Americans had not seen that before. Very common, well-known in the cities, but not well-known beyond that. So a lot of youth and adults kind of latched onto that. They thought that was a pretty unique lifestyle, and so that was a popular entryway. Back in the 40s and the 50s, after World War II, when the tribes were going through the relocation policies of the federal government, which was the federal government's effort to try to terminate the tribes, a lot of Native Americans were shifted and moved to the cities. And from that result, we have pretty significant Native American populations living in cities like Chicago, Los Angeles, San Diego, Portland, Seattle. And those families that were moved to the cities, of course, stayed there. A lot of them became very urbanized, and a lot of their youth became either involved in gang activity themselves, or they were exposed to urban gang activity. Then what would happen is that these families would eventually move back to their tribal communities, and the youth would bring the gang culture with them, either as experienced gang members or as having been around and exposed to the gang lifestyle and coming back to the tribal community and wanting to represent or be something unique to the tribal community, then taking it upon themselves to share that culture with the youth in that location. And so that was a pretty strong impact there. Today we do have Native American kids who are involved in gangs at the urban level who are specifically being sent to the reservations now to specifically organize and structure the youth gangs that may exist there at this time. Native American kids who were institutionalized by through committing offenses and then being sentenced to institutions generally off reservation were exposed to those youth who were also in the institution who were gang-affected kids or gang-involved kids from the cities. And so learning of the culture inside the institution, being released eventually and coming back to the community was another way that this process took place. Children imitating older gang-affiliated relatives. We are now at the multi-generational stage of gangs. Back in the 90s, when this first started, that was really our first generation gang members, but some of them have now become adults. They've had children, and now we're having young children beginning to identify with the gang culture because their parents or their older brothers were involved in, or sisters were involved in the gang world. So we're seeing that aspect of it as well. There were some observations that we made in our early contact with the gang members out in the communities. In the beginning, it was typical, I guess, of any gang evolution, but minor criminal activity, vandalism, graffiti, minor assaults, those types of things. There was no true leadership that was standing out from any of the tribal communities that we went to. We did not hear of any good leadership out there. So the youth gangs that were functioning in the 90s were fairly weak. They didn't have any structure. Obviously, they had no history from which to draw from, and they had no particular direction that they were going. So at that point, they were just basically getting together, engaging in minor activities. There was a lot of alcohol, some drugs involved, but there was actually no direction in which they were going. So at that time would have been a real opportunity for tribes to have gone after the gangs and kind of nipped it in the bud before it started growing. I recall a time that we were doing a training in Montana. We saw gang activity. We reported it to their police. They said, oh, it's just one of these. The next time we came back, they'd had their first drive-by shooting. And so the proliferation and the evolution went very quickly. There has been very little study done on the Native youth gangs specifically. There's been pretty significant studies done on urban gangs, but there were some early studies done between 95 and 2000. Each of the studies that were done had their problems and the weaknesses and limitations of those particular studies. The FBI did a very small study, but it was probably the most accurate in terms of what they predicted, because everything they predicted in that study has happened. The FBI indicated that Native gangs were in the early stages of development, which in the 1990s was very true. They indicated that at this time there was no hierarchy, no leadership, and we had observed that, and that was very true. Then they indicated that there was a potential for rapid growth, criminal consolidation, and intensification of activities. And at the time that wasn't happening, but now it has happened. And so in less than a decade, we have gangs, Native gangs, both urban and reservation, that have become involved as major players in drug trafficking and have made affiliations and associations with other major criminal organizations. And this is creating a really significant threat to tribal communities' safety and security. And but as of yet, in the work that we've done, we still haven't seen very much funding or very much in terms of providing work in the tribal communities in addressing that issue. Today, we see Native youth gangs that have both strong youth leadership, young people who have evolved and developed into strong leaders for the groups, and then we've also seen what we didn't want to see, and that's strong adult leadership. And where a lot of the adult leadership is coming from are really two places. One is kids that started in the 90s who've now become adults, and they continue to provide or continue to engage in gang activity. And then the other place that we're seeing it is from the prison gangs. 15 years ago, if somebody would have told me that there would have been significant all-Native prison gangs, I wouldn't have believed it, but now we do have those. In a number of states, there have been enough numbers of Native people locked up in prison that they have formed their own gangs, and they primarily have indicated that a desire of controlling outside criminal activity, very similar to how the Mexican Mafia control activity from inside the prison. So adults, Native American adults being released from prison, have been sent to particular reservations, specifically with the instructions of organizing the youth gang activities for the purposes of moving and trafficking in drugs for the most part. We have youth gangs who have alliances with major gangs, the major street gangs, the gangs that are from the city. For example, we had the incident up in Wisconsin where one of the tribal youth gangs had a formal agreement and a formal alliance with the Latin Kings from Chicago. And in that particular scenario, they were moving about 40 pounds of meth a month through that reservation with the support of the Latin King organization. There are groups that have alliances and relationships with the cartels down in the southwestern area, all the way up here actually to the northwest where I'm currently sitting. There are Mexican drug cartels that have formal alliances with Native American gang groups in terms of storing, trafficking, moving, and selling drugs that are coming up from Mexico and Central and South America. Up here with the tribes that are along the Canadian border, that exists as well, but there's also the addition of Asian drug cartels who have worked with some of the tribes up here in terms of moving some of the stuff they're trying to smuggle into the United States. At the national level, we had the situation over on the East Coast where there were native traffickers who had a formal alliance with the mafia on the East Coast for the purposes of moving drugs and contraband from Canada through their reservation into the United States. There has been major crime and there has been homicides. A decade ago, we could brag that we didn't really ever have a homicide as it related to the gangs, and now we can't. We've had homicides, and the drug trafficking has been the biggest mover in terms of changing what and how the gangs are functioning. So the gangs that are trying to establish themselves are trying to follow suit, and they're doing a pretty good job of following suit with how the urban gangs work, and that is to retaliate against anybody that stands up against them and to earn the type of respect that gang members desire. And so that requires them to have that reputation, and so they are building reputation. And so that threat alone is pretty significant, and there's been some pretty unfortunate incidents in some communities where that's happened. So going to the 3 R's of gang life: reputation, respect, retaliation. This is how gangs earn their status, and this is how gangs get that recognition and that respect, the perceived respect that they need in order to get what they feel they need to accomplish. Unfortunately, for the smaller youth gangs on some reservations that are trying to be absorbed by the larger gangs, that has resulted in some pretty serious confrontations and some possible death. So we have pretty much the spectrum when it comes to Native Americans involved in gangs. We have our local reservation gang. I used to try to keep track of the names of these groups, but there are so many and they change names so quickly I kind of gave up on that. You'll hear names that are associated with well-known gangs. You'll hear of native gangs that use the terms Crip or Bloods or Latin Kings or whoever in their names. That doesn't mean that they're directly or really associated with those major gangs, but they do adapt the names for that. They've created their own gang, their own names for their gangs. I'm not a big fan of Gang 101 training. You know, there's so much Gang 101 training that goes around and shows you the signs and the tattoos and the graffiti and all that. And the bottom line is, the way we view it, if it quacks like a duck, it's a duck. So that's how you need to address it. Learning all that other stuff is kind of entertaining, but it doesn't really help you work with the offenders. We have gangs from the youth gang members who live on the reservation, but they belong to a neighboring gang off reservation. This happens a lot with the tribes that are near a city or in a city. For example, the Puyallup Reservation here in Tacoma, where though they do now have their own gangs, early on in the evolution of the gangs, a lot of their members belong to gangs inside Tacoma that were based in Tacoma. Same way in Portland, Oregon, we have Native Americans who belong to gangs inside the city of Portland, and they weren't from the reservation. We have Native American youth who live in the city and belong to the urban street gangs. One of my gang outreach workers who I used to speak to Native American youth was a number 2 shot caller for a major urban street gang in Portland. He's Choctaw, and he was born and raised in Los Angeles, so he had a lot of gang affiliation. And he belonged to a major Hispanic gang and grew in rank until he was the number 2 shot caller. So that there's that aspect. Major urban street gangs that have all Native Americans associated with it. Native Mob in Minneapolis is probably the most well-known of the major urban all-Indian street gangs, and the Native Mob is making huge efforts to try to establish themselves on reservations, not just in Minnesota or the Midwest. They're trying to establish sets all across the United States. And they have pretty powerful intentions in doing that in order to control drugs. And then, as I mentioned before, we had our prison gangs, all native prison gangs, both in Canada and the United States, that also try to exercise their powers outside of the prison. Things are changing with the gangs, but there are some differences between those that are involved in the urban gangs and those on the reservation gangs. Some of the interesting things that we saw in the past decade is that on a lot of reservation gangs, the youth can quit, and they can even quit and join another gang if they want to. We've seen where one brother is in one gang, another brother's in a different gang, and then if one decides to quit, there's a price to pay. Usually you'll get a beat down. If you branded yourself, they might cut the brand off, and then you can join the other gang and get re-beat in and re-gang, branded if that's what the requirement is. Normally in the urban gangs you can't do that. The other thing we see is branding versus tattoos. There aren't a lot of tattoo parlors out in some of our reservations, and so what the youth do is they heat up knife blades or pieces of metal, and they brand themselves with their gang affiliation on there. Problem with that, of course, is that can get infected, and they can get quite sick from that. For the past decade, our gang members were younger in age than most of the urban average age gangs, and that's because it wasn't multi-generational. They were just starting out. But of course, that group is now aging. We're talking 15 years and more now in terms of those that started as gangs as youngsters, and so that group is aging. Girl gangs in Indian country, a lot of the native girls don't particularly want to be property of native guys, and so they have formed their own gangs. In talking to those that have dealt with the girl gangs on the reservations, they can be very violent, often more violent than the boy gangs are. But the benefit is that those who are doing outreach have found that the girls are easier to intervene with and move out of the gang lifestyle than the guys are. But that is kind of a unique difference with the reservation gangs. Also with reservation gangs, they have a tendency not necessarily to claim a territory in terms of boundaries, like when you go to the cities and you see where a particular gang has a neighborhood or a block of buildings and that type of thing. You can go through a lot of tribal communities and see gangs kind of claiming the whole place or claiming the same area. And so it's not necessarily territorial bound, though that there are some housing areas that are like that. It's also not money-driven or drug-driven, because in a lot of our communities, the poverty levels are quite high. For example, Pine Ridge, there is not a lot of money or drug movement out there that's typical of urban gangs, because nobody has money to buy anything. And so even though they like to hype up the native gang issues on Pine Ridge, if people have watched Gangland, a show which I don't particularly care for because the kids watch it, they did the episode on Pine Ridge, and they really emphasized this big number, 5,000 gang members at Pine Ridge. But the bottom line is they don't function like the urban gangs, because they do not have the funds. There isn't the resources there for them to go after. So it's not always about money or drugs, but that is different, of course, in the other gangs. Always exceptions to everything, but in the cities, the native kids tend to join the Hispanic gangs, primarily because similarity in skin color and a little bit of similarity in background. They follow the codes established by that gang, whatever the gang has set up. They are being sent and have been sent out to the reservations in order to establish leadership, make connections with the youth gangs that are on the reservation community in order to get those connections made so that more activity can take place there. Native urban youth gangs tend to follow similar patterns as urban gangs, with the exceptions that we talked about. Native prison gangs, again, prior to the native population being strong enough to form their own gangs, many belong to Hispanic gangs, so they learned the trade from the Mexican mafia and how they operate. So they are also sending inmates who are released out to reservation communities in an effort to organize, and they provide that adult leadership, which the kids want to look up to. When you talk to urban gang members, they talk about the OGs, the original gangsters. They're legendary, they're historical, and a lot of our tribal kids don't have that. So when somebody does come out of prison or goes to prison, those kind of become the OGs to them. So when they come out in an effort to try to help organize, then they become the OGs to these kids, someone to look up to. In the youth gang outreach work that our group has done, culture, the tribal culture, has been one of the things we've been able to use. We've been able to get kids to walk away from gang life by getting involved in a variety of cultural components to the tribe, historical components, spirituality components. And the problem is those that are coming out to try to organize the gangs also know this. We had one reservation where two guys came out of prison. They were trying to structure the gang that was there, and they started a drum group, invited kids to join the drum group, which is a cultural component, but then they would try to recruit the kids into the gang from the drum group. So they used the same tools that we're trying to use to pull the kids away from the gang activity. One of the things that we want to try to share with our people on the reservation communities in any event is that when you're supervising Native youth who are gang affiliated, we try not to focus on the gang itself, but focus on the client, focus on the youth. The gang outreach workers that are on our team actually try not to even address the gang issue at all with the clients, because every time you acknowledge their association or affiliation with the gang, it like gives them power, and so they don't want to do that. So they focus very much on the client and not so much on the gang. Obviously, this is where being a probation officer and working with gangs in the cities or in the rural areas or on reservations pretty much comes together for the same things. Setting up that relationship, doing your risk and needs assessment on these kids, and it has to be a realistic needs assessment. The same things need to apply, trying to find employment, trying to further the education, looking for training, looking at all the addiction issues, medical needs that these individuals might have, what their personal needs are, and obviously addressing any of the conditions of the court, and then the needs of the client's family. These are all things that have to be looked at. Some of the issues, though, that we have in a lot of our communities is we have very high unemployment and there are no jobs, and so that causes problems. We have been out to many of the schools, and a lot of the schools have a zero gang tolerance, and these kids aren't allowed back into those schools, and then there aren't any alternatives available in many communities. And so that puts up a roadblock. Access to training centers are pretty limited. One of the things that this is true with all gangs and not just tribal gangs, but the issue of FAS is something that has been a common thread with a lot of members involved in these gangs. So these all have to be addressed in trying to establish that relationship and working with these kids to get them out into a different direction. I just mentioned FAS, but all the other major health factors that the youth have to deal with, and in some cases we kind of exceed the standards. FAS, of course, is a big issue. Addiction is a big issue, both alcohol and drug, depression, anxiety, suicide. Our Native American youth commit suicide at four times the national rate. I was just at a community in Minnesota that has had 2 teenage suicides in a matter of 2 weeks, and that is a population of 500 members. So the suicide issue is quite large, and gang members have a higher suicide rate anyway. So if you add the gang issue along to the tribal youth issue, that's going to increase that suicide potential. Meds, mental health diagnosis, sex abuse. Sex abuse is an area again, that is pretty substantial with a lot of gang members, and there was a study done not that long ago in California where they discovered that a lot of the major gang members in California had all been sexually abused, And so that sex abuse plays a role in this as well. There have been no studies with the Native kids, but in talking to those that were willing to talk, that seems to be a pretty true indicator of something that's happened there. Developmental disabilities, another aspect that needs to be addressed. Gang culture has been substituted for the youth's family or the youth's community. It wasn't really this powerful back in a decade or more ago, but right now the gangs have established themselves to the point that some of your efforts as probation officers in trying to get the youth to leave the gang and get back involved in tribal community, they will attempt to prevent that. In the tribal community, which is small and everybody kind of knows each other, this does kind of create some problems, particularly for the probation officer that's trying to work with the offender. They will make efforts to prevent the youth from getting back into the community without the gang involved. So something just to keep in mind. And here at the Tribal Probation Academy, where I am right now, we do emphasize a lot of safety. In the past, we didn't have as much violence associated with these gangs, but now we're seeing a lot more violence. And there was a time where on the reservation communities where our police officers were never attacked by gang members. Now we do have that. And so obviously that puts probation officers at subsequent risk in this regard as well. So just a big reminder that the gang isn't going to be happy with any effort that is done by probation to try to move these kids out of their gang lifestyle. The family-based approach is really important because within the tribal communities, family tends to be everything. And when you're working with a young Native gang member, especially if you're an urban probation officer, you kind of need to wonder who is this kid, who's his family, what tribe is he affiliated with. And if you can find those things out, then you can try to identify if there's any resources out there that you could use in working with this particular offender. In our tribal communities, we tend to know who the client's family is and their affiliation. So the tribal PO generally has kind of a handle on this, and we do try to use the family and try to use the culture as a way to work with this offender. At the city level, that's something that might have to be researched. One example I have was a young Native gang member in Portland. The gang outreach guys went to him, asked him what tribe he came from. He said all he knew he was an Indian. He didn't know what tribe he was from, didn't know who his family was. Frank Kaywood, the outreach worker, took the kid into the Native American Center. They did some research. They found out what his tribal affiliation was. They found out who his family was, and as it turned out, he happened to be a direct descendant of a pretty significant historical member of that tribe. The offender became interested in that aspect, and he began reconnecting with the family that he had lost connection with, and he actually left gang life and pursued other activities through education and completely turned his life around. And that was really all it took in that case. So it is kind of something that's important. There are resources in the cities that are provided to Native American people through Indian Health Service and a number of other sources. So if you do have an offender on your caseload who is a Native American and you can identify the tribe, you might be able to do some research and find out what resources are available to him as a tribal member. And so that would be one of the reasons that would be important to identify this young person's tribal identity. Culturally significant issues. Is the probation officer culturally competent? Well, it's one of those things that is important. In fact, here at the Probation Academy, we are doing this right today. We're talking about that city probation officers are faced with a wide range of cultures that they have to address. We were talking about how in Portland, Oregon, we had the Chinese community, a large Russian community, a Vietnamese community. We have Native Americans. So there's all these cultures that the probation officer is going to be working with. When it comes to Native American culture, one of the big errors that people make is trying to paint Native Americans with one paintbrush, that all natives are the same. And that's really not true at all. There's over 560 recognized tribes in the nation. They're different. They're different culturally, language-wise, protocol-wise. They're all very different. So it's important that when you do identify the tribal affiliation of a youth that you become aware as best you can of the cultural aspect of that particular tribe. Because if you're going to reach out to them to assist you with resources to work with the youth, you want to make sure that the approach is correct and that you're reaching out for the right people and the right resources to work with the youthful offender. So, you know, if you work in a native area where you have tribes located around you, even though they may be, you know, 3 or 4 tribes within your area, they're going to be a little bit different from each other. If you work in the city, those tribal people were moved to the city back in the relocation days from all over the United States, so you'll have a mixture of tribal membership in those areas. How connected they are culturally, it's hard to tell until you begin working with them. But being able to reach out to a tribe or to tribal communities to see if there are resources that they can assist you with in working with the offender is pretty critical. And if you can get it, it will help make your job a little bit easier. One of the things that is important to understand is the historical trauma of Native American people and their families. The Native American community has had to survive a huge host of federal policies that included basically non-ruled warfare, losses of entire communities. There's been a lot of death. The federal policies have gone from assimilation to termination to self-determination. It's gone back and forth. So the tribes have had to survive a lot of different federal policies that have been applied to them. Some of them were pretty damaging, particularly when you're in the termination and the assimilation phases. During the assimilation, the boarding schools were built and Native American children were pried away from their families, sent off to boarding schools. In the boarding schools, there was very severe discipline, particularly if they tried to speak their language or demonstrated anything tribal. These individuals, when they were released, came home. If they had children or got married, they tended to apply the type of discipline they learned in boarding school to the children. So what we ended up doing is losing a generation or two of parenting skills. And of course that created the snowball effect, and this has caused problems. When a probation officer is sitting there with the Native youth at the desk, you are looking at the result of a lot of very misplaced and ill-directed policies that impacted these communities to the point where it's been very destructive. And this has a big effect, and it probably explains why a lot of issues in Indian country are counter to what goes on in the rest of the country, like the teen suicide rate, the epidemic rate of domestic violence in tribal communities, the issues with alcohol and addiction, and all these statistics which are significantly higher than the national average. And there's a lot of significance to the tribal spiritual aspect of balance. And there are spiritual people out there, there are medicine people, there are cultural people who are willing to work with offenders to help bring them back into balance. And while sometimes this doesn't seem to be a known way of doing stuff, it is something that has an ability to work. So we would encourage that you stay open-minded, and if you can find somebody of this nature that can come in and work with any of the offenders, at least it's worth the try to restore that balance and get things back with them. So the question is, can you find these people? If they're out there in your community, if you're off reservation, can you find people like that? And so I would try to locate the Native American center, the community center, if there's one in your area. Talk to people, see if they can direct you out on the tribal communities. They know who those people are. Learn the protocols, learn what's the proper way to approach these folks, to ask their help and to get them involved with the offenders. But with the youth program that I run, the National Indian Youth Program, we do use these people a lot, and we bring them to our program for almost 3 weeks to work with these kids. And not all of our kids are offenders. Some of our kids are pretty rounded kids, but just seeing how that balance, that restored balance, helps them so much when they get back home and they're trying to pick up with their lives again. This is touchy, but this works. If you can find an ex-offender, somebody who was a gang member, somebody who has lived that life and who has left it, they're very valuable as mentors. Obviously, you have to be really careful when you do this. I mean, you got to make sure this is somebody that's left the gang lifestyle. I use a gentleman named Glen Lamont. He's the guy who was the #2 shot caller with the gangs in Portland and came up from Los Angeles. We found Glen in prison. We brought him out. He went through some sweat lodge ceremonies with some of our outreach people, and he decided to change his life around, and he did. I personally didn't use him for a year. I wanted him to prove that he could do it, and I've now used him for about the last 8 years in working with youth. I take him around to tribal communities, and he works very hard at mentoring kids and getting them to walk away from the gang lifestyles and adapting more positive forms of life. He's currently working for as a street level gang outreach worker, and he's also available to go out on site and work with people. He's very good at educating police officers, teachers. I bring him up here and he speaks at the Probation Academy in letting folks know the ins and outs of gang life and some of the areas that you need to be careful of and what you can do to approach and have access to these kids. So these guys can be very valuable, but again, you got to be very careful, obviously, in choosing somebody like that. Elders are huge. Elders are the center of most tribal cultures. Now, for me, there's a difference between an elder and an old tribal member, and I guess as a tribal member I can say that. A tribal elder is somebody who demonstrates the wisdom of their years. They know the history and the culture and all of those aspects of the tribe. And because of that, they become very valuable in the connection that they can make with youthful offenders. Some tribes have elder courts. Elder courts, instead of going in front of a judge or a jury or anything like that, an elder court is a system where the elders hear the criminal case and then the elders pronounce sentence. And most of their sentencing is restorative justice types of concepts where the youthful offenders have to give back to the tribal community, and part of that includes communication with elders to try to reconnect to the tribe and to the culture and to the elders themselves. Doesn't work for everybody, but it works pretty well. But when you can locate elders that are willing to work with you, it really does enhance a lot of efforts. I was in one community where they were having a lot of difficulty with youth in a particular school. They started bringing elders in, and the children would not act negatively in front of an elder. And it changed the whole environment of that particular school when the elders became involved. So if you can identify elders and get them to be involved, then that would certainly be a huge asset. Identifying the barriers to getting these things done. What are the barriers that are out there for trying to work with a native offender, and what are their barriers, and what are the barriers as far as the family's concerned? So one of the approaches we take is trying to get the barriers removed. Everybody knows that when you hit a barrier and you can't get past it, we lose a lot of momentum with an offender that we may have moving in the right direction, and celebrating every time a barrier is removed with the offender so they can feel that progress and feel that success. Again, with my youth program, we'll have kids there who may not have ever actually accomplished something, and when they finish our program and they get their certificate, that's the first time they've actually completed something, and they're really proud, and it inspires so much energy in them to want to go out and try something else, to see what else they could accomplish. So it's just kind of priming the pump to get them going especially if they actually achieve something when in the past they really haven't been able to do so. So positive reinforcement, strength, community service being used as a positive reinforcement. That's what the elder courts do. Our sentencing circles do that. Get the youthful offender out in the community to give back to the community. And in doing so, reinforce the idea that they're part of the community and they're an important part of the community. Youth are always the future for any society, and so we don't want that to be lost on our clients, particularly those that have changed their lifestyle to the gang lifestyle. And then with gang members, behavior. You know, we really focus on behavioral change with the youthful Native gang member. We put those restrictions on there, and so we have to address when there is non-compliance. The examples here, obviously, if they keep wearing gang colors or clothes, hanging out with gang members, gang locations, still engaging in gang activity, that needs to be addressed, and it has to be there has to be those sanctions involved. The problems we see in many communities is they're very limited on what sanctions they can engage in. And so there are those issues to deal with too. On the other side, we certainly want to celebrate the success and give them the pats on the back and give them the appropriate praise when they are successful, when they do accomplish something, no matter how small it is. So the congratulations for being prompt, for being polite, presentable, polite, being honest, all those things, being compliant, not getting back into drugs or alcohol, doing everything they're supposed to do. So the old adage, you know, that you'll get more accomplished with sugar than the other is really applicable here. So, and we have found that a lot of our youth that we've worked with really respond well when they're given some praise for actually accomplishing something. Everybody knows they're criticized enough in their lives as it is. So an education plan, you know, getting them to set up for a success in life, working on those education skills, the reading and the writing, giving them that confidence to learn, get rid of the here and now thinking with more long-term planning. I'll never forget one gang member told me that there was never any teacher who believed in him until he ran into one teacher. And one teacher inspired him to try and got him interested in some history. And what has happened with a lot of the schools that have zero gang policies is they kick the kids out. When you kick the kids out, then they have nowhere to go, so they associate with those that feel displaced and no longer part of the program, and so I think it just adds to the problem. Our philosophy, at least with schools, is you should keep these kids close, keep them closer, perhaps, maybe than the other folks. But getting them back into the learning world is important. Real gang members, real hardcore gang members, they're not in school. They have dropped out. If you have kids who are in school, even if they're professing to be gang members, even if they are, the fact that they're in school is a huge asset. And that means somebody has some control with this person, so that gives you some tools to work with. So if you're in doubt, reach out, develop a network of people who do work in Indian country. I think one of the things I've experienced with probation compared with law enforcement is that probation is much more willing to work with each other. We have spent 5 or 6 decades trying to build the relationships between tribal police and non-tribal police, and that has been very difficult. In the work that we've been doing with probation, both tribal and non-tribal, over the last 5 years, I have found a much more powerful willingness of people to work with each other and help each other out in working with offenders. So develop a network for people working in Indian country. Teaching right now over in my probation academy is a Maricopa County probation officer who I met when they reached out to attend one of our tribal trainings because they wanted to learn more about some of their constituency, which is on some of the reservations in their jurisdiction. And now they're actually teaching here at the probation academy. So reach out for assistance and advice. I think a lot of people are willing to provide that. And it's okay to run a plan past an Indian country probation officer. If you have an idea and you want to make sure that it's culturally okay, you know, make a contact with a tribal probation officer and ask them, what do you think, if this is going to work or not? You know, don't want to offend anybody. What do you think? And take their opinion. Take several opinions. So feel free to reach out to tribal probation officers or elders or whoever you can contact for that kind of assistance. The strength of Indian country is we call it the blessings of tradition. The culture and spirituality of Indian country isn't just something you do, it's the way of life for most Native Americans. So this is the strength we have in working with our offenders. And while sometimes when we look at our caseloads we think maybe not, but it really does. It is something that we can use. And I believe that non-tribal probation officers working in urban areas or counties that are not part of a reservation, if you have a Native American on your caseload, I believe that this is something that you can use as well if you reach out to tribal membership for that type of assistance. At this point, I believe I am turning this over to Mary Ann, or Adam is going to turn this over to Mary Ann. I believe there will be questions after this. If I can answer any questions, or if you want to contact me, my contact information is at the end of the program.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Give me just a second. But before we pass it along to Mary Ann, who's going to go through just a few slides with us, I want to remind folks that if they have any questions, feel free to go ahead and put those in the chat box, and we can be sure to answer those in the remaining half hour or so that we have. And then I'll turn it over to Mary Ann to continue. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you, Adam. Just some additional information I'd like to provide our participants. There are a variety of resources available on APPA's PSN dedicated website, which includes a desktop guide for tribal probation personnel, the screening and assessment process, also youth gangs in Indian country, the American Indians in crime, and additional resources. And finally, of course, we would like to mention our website, the APPA website, and you can certainly review resources that we have available for community corrections professionals. And if you are already a member of APPA, thank you for your support. And if you are not a member of APPA, please visit our website today to join and begin taking advantage of all the resources we provide for our members, including our quarterly journal, perspectives, discounts on registration for our annual and winter training institutes, and discounts on online training courses, and much more. And we do have some questions that are posed for Dave. The first question, Dave, is on the Navajo reservation. Do you know if the suicides that happened in 2010 and 2011 were gang related?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Specifically, I don't know. I mean, that's something certainly that I could find out, but I do not personally know if that was gang associated or not. A lot of the suicides, in fact, I was just down in Tucson and was looking at one of the, just happened upon a suicide report there, and that was a gang member who committed suicide in that particular case. But the suicides are high amongst Native youth, and again, high with gang members. So when you combine the two, you're bound to see that increase statistically, but I do not know for sure.
Okay, thank you. And then another question, it surrounds the citation or reference for the California study indicating that sexual abuse among gang members is high. And if you provide that resource or the reference or citation for me, I can certainly pass it on to individuals who would like to know more information regarding that study. And whoever posed the question, if you could just send me an email indicating that you wish to have some additional information, I would be more than happy to share that information. And then, Dave, our audience, I think, may be interested in knowing some of the prevention and intervention programs that are available for Native youth.
Well, there is no national prevention or intervention programs. These programs develop locally at each level, and so there's a variety of those out there. One of the things that always strikes me with the people that do this type of work is how dedicated they are to the cause individually. And we talk about proactive officer participation, and when we talk about that, we're talking about police officers, probation officers, people who are in contact with offenders, who know that of their gang involvement or their gang membership, and then proactively go out there basically working one-on-one. You will find it frustrating, if not impossible, to address the gang problem itself, and I guess that's why we say focus on the individual. The successful intervention programs that I've seen have been individuals who have worked with one youth at a time in trying to convince them to leave the gang lifestyle and go in another direction. And I've seen that work both in cities and in rural communities. One of the things that stands out to me, I mentioned this in a different discussion that we've had, but Father Greg Boyle down in Los Angeles, he's probably got the largest intervention program in existence. And one of the interesting things about him is that he will not take anybody in this program who doesn't want to quit the gang lifestyle. But what will surprise you is when you talk to a lot of hardcore gang members or gang members, if they had a choice, they would leave. Unfortunately, in a lot of the environments they grow up in, it's a way of life. It's just normal. And but when you talk about, when you ask them something like to envision a future for their children, most of them are not going to indicate gang life as a part of that. You know, they have other visions for children than that. With our native gangs, it's at least in the reservation area, sometimes that's hard to do because some of them are not as hardcore, say, as some of the urban gangs are, and so they are less willing to just walk away from it. There's some peer problems with that. But we have seen it done, and it's always been kind of from that personal, one-on-one, proactive officer approach.
Very good. So what I hear you talking about really is the proactive strategy that you feel probation officers as well as police officers should take. Are there any other strategies, supervision strategies specific for probation officers that you would recommend, Dave?
The strategies would you know, other than the ones that I talked about, where you try to involve ex-felons, or not ex-felons, but ex-gang members, elders, using the restorative justice concepts that Native America uses, elder courts, those kinds of things. Your other approaches are not a lot different than any other gang youth that you're going to be working with. I would emphasize that safety is a must in doing any of this stuff. But in working with the tribal community, I guess the message that I was trying to send out was for those of you who are in urban areas, feel free to reach out to your tribal counterparts. for resource identification and resource sharing, identifying those that could help you work with the youthful offender. For those in the tribal world working on the tribal communities, my message would be to kind of do the same thing, kind of look outside, see what's working on the outside in terms of working with youth, and just kind of find what's going to work best for the individual. As far as a template plan, putting together a gang task force. Gang task force have certain goals in mind, but that individual approach, in my opinion, seems to be the one thing that works the most. A caring, positive adult contact. I mean, I've said this 1,000 times over the last 15 years, but one positive contact with an adult with a youthful gang member is worth a zillion bucks. They have so many negatives, and so a lot of it is just building that relationship, building the trust, and then seeing where you can go from there.
Thank you. Another question that we have is there any information or your knowledge, do you have any knowledge about the Native youth aging out of gangs? So is there an aging out process that you see in the gangs?
I haven't really seen too much aging out because we're so new. Our youth are so new. When you consider that our first gangs began in the mid-90s, so we've got kids now who are in their 20s, a little bit into their 20s, so and a little older. We still see them actively participating in gang activity. I've met a few that have aged out and grew up and decided to go make a living doing something, but I'm actually kind of surprised to see how many older Native people are still doing the gang thing. And this is not being helped by the return of individuals from prison, and it's not being helped by the major gangs who are recruiting. So I haven't really seen a big aging out. Where I have seen a decrease is with the females. I have seen females walk away earlier and quicker than the guys do.
Okay. And we have several more questions, Dave. The next one is, have you noticed any nexus between outlaw motorcycle gangs and Native youth?
That's a great question, and it's a really important question, and no, but let me tell you what's important about it. We do have an all-Native motorcycle gang. They formed in Canada. In talking to Canadian law enforcement, they consider that gang to be the greatest threat up there beyond their youth street gangs. The motorcycle gang has a formal alliance with some motorcycle gangs that are at war with Hell's Angels. Apparently, a couple of members of the Native gang took out a couple of Hell's Angels, survived the attack, and are in prison in Canada, and therefore they've established quite a reputation. The goal of the motorcycle gang is to, of course, like all of them, is to move drugs and to profit from drug activity. So there is some affiliation. One of the Canadian prison gangs also formed an alliance alternately with Hell's Angels for the same purpose. So motorcycle gangs do play a role here, and while I don't see the motorcycle gangs currently having anything to do with the youth, they certainly are associating with the all-Native motorcycle gang, and they're associating with the prison gangs.
Okay, and could you briefly describe some of the Native gang tags?
Oh goodness, there's tons of them. There's a ton. I'll say that the one that you want to watch, the one that you want to watch out for is Native Mob. Native Mob is growing. They're strong. There have been some major arrests on their leadership, but those guys were quickly replaced. Those are a group that you want to be careful of. They have recruited as far away from their home turf as the West Coast here. They've been down to several of the reservations along the Pacific Coast and all points in between. But when you look at tribal gang groups, the names change so fast, and like I said, I used to keep a list, and I just couldn't keep up with it. So.
Okay. And are you aware of any federal funding for job training for Native youth?
Personally, I am not, no. And I'm not sure where you would look for that. My work is primarily with Department of Justice funding, and that funding goes towards resources for law enforcement and probation and training. So I'm not personally familiar. I'm sure somebody must know that.
Okay. And if someone does know the answer to that question, you can simply email it to me, and I will share that information with the participant who asked the question. The next question, what do you think about gang affiliations in tribes with significant per capita resources? Since poverty is not an issue, what do you think motivates these youth to be gang affiliated, or gang involved?
Okay, now I get up on a soapbox, and this is where I torque off some Native people, and I don't mean to do that, but we've watched per cap destroy Native youth. It is interesting to note how much gang activity is involved in the high per cap tribes, and the reason that happens, based on our observations, is for a couple of reasons. One, when you are a high per cap tribe and you make more money than anybody else in the area, bi-weekly or monthly, there's a lot of boredom involved in that. And so with individuals who do not want to go to work or go to school and they got money, for some reason there's an attraction to being a gangbanger, or to feel that role or to play that role. There was one case where the individual turned 18, she got her initial per cap, she went out and bought a brand spanking new Cadillac Escalade, and then even though there was no need for money, nobody was starving here, they went down to another reservation that was poor and tried to sell drugs and got caught by the police. And now the police drive around in a nice Cadillac Escalade, and that person's in prison. What motivates somebody to, when they have the finances that they don't need to commit crime, is subject to all kinds of review. But the other thing that we see is when there is a per cap tribe and young adults are getting these amounts of money, the gangs themselves, the city gangs, the urban gangs, they take a look at that and they want that money. And so what they do is they'll go out and try to grab these young tribal people, move them, get them into the gang, and then of course once you belong to a gang, what is yours is theirs. And having visited, and kind of what surprises me too is I've visited a number of the wealthier casinos, and this gang interaction is just out in the open for everybody to watch and see. There isn't even any hiding of it. So it's been a frustrating aspect for people who work with youth, because the destructive nature of that is kind of obvious. But it certainly adds to the gang issue. So yeah, you're right. I guess the issue with gangs is it really doesn't have to do with the amount of wealth anybody has, because there are gangs in cities that are kids that are wealthy. We had a pretty famous case of a very wealthy bunch of Caucasian kids who formed a gang and went out and did just as much violence as some of the other gangs did. So I just think it's that attraction to that gang lifestyle. As the kids will say, the bling. So that's about the best answer I can give you, but I've certainly seen the destruction and the devastation that has caused.
Okay, thank you, Dave. Is there any effort to change the no gang policies in schools, or an effort to build additional alternative schools?
When we go out and talk to the schools and to the teachers and to the administrators, when we do our gang programs out there, we encourage that. Zero you can have a zero gang policy, but I think it has to just be reasonable. If somebody's a threat, then of course you have to deal with that. But when you have somebody that's just wearing shoelaces or just wearing a belt or doing something like that, I think booting them out of school is the wrong move. And getting them to stay involved is kind of a key. When you boot them out, that just is adding to the problem. And so we've seen schools adjust their thinking on that, and of course the paramount concern is safety, and that always has to be the ultimate concern. But yeah, we've seen some schools change some of their policies in that regard. Unfortunately, in light of recent events and school shootings and stuff, you know, you have to be very careful in that regard. But we have seen some change in that world. You had a second part to that question. I forgot what it was.
Are you seeing any additional alternative?
Oh, the alternative schools, yeah. It really depends on where you are, but there are some places that have developed some alternative training programs, alternative schools, things like that. Obviously, those kinds of resources are more available in urban communities than they are in reservation communities, but a number of tribes have put alternative programs together, and that individuals who have been booted out of the public school or the tribal school can go to. Ideally, if an outreach worker can really get a young person to start turning things around, it would be nice to see them get back into public school if they can maintain, of course. One of the things that a lot of gang outreach workers use are gang contracts. And these contracts are agreements that if they stay away from gang life, then the outreach or probation will do this, that, and the other, including helping with the education or the employment, that type of thing. And in the contract, there's sanctions and penalties. There's also places where, like, if you want to get the gang tattoos removed, working out a partnership with a medical facility or a plastic surgeon or somebody, the people that do the tattoo removals or the tattoo cover-ups, that can be done. It's been working in urban settings, and it's been pretty successful for the rural communities that have tried that. My former gang member, who I use in working with youth, went through that process. He had so many tattoos, though, from his neck all the way down and his wrists all the way back, that we couldn't remove them. He just basically got them covered over. So a tattoo artist came in and covered up all of the gang stuff. So those are kind of little programs that have a tendency to help and work as well.
Mm-hmm. Does anyone have anything else they want to add before we close? Adam, Dave? If not, I would like to thank everyone for their participation and hope to see you at future broadcasts. Thank you and have a great day.
Okay, thank you.